disrupt the order of things.
Yeah, sometimes that's good.
We should go around. My name is David Flasherman, and just a relatively new member of the Energy Committee.
To meet you.
Allison Collier, you know me.
See you.
You know, us,
Stuart.
and you know me.
Fellas.
Yeah.
Just for a couple of years, I've been around just long enough to recognize most faces and not know everybody's name yet.
So just, I think, so the Energy Committee decided that David, Allison, and Ben, who works full-time and can't be here, are going to be our point people on this, on the assessment project. And so just maybe from the get-go, so you're aware of that. I guess what I'm concerned about, or would like to know, what's the progression? We all have a couple of questions, but
Yeah.
maybe to start out, how is this project going to progress? I assume we're planning on sitting down and making our recommendations of projects for each building that we think make sense. And there are some criteria we probably need to ask about, come back to that. And then I assume we're going to present that to the select board. The question is, when do contractors come in?
Ideally, as soon as possible. And so to be clear, for most of my towns, the select board is the group of folks that I've been working with kind of throughout the process. There's one select member that has kind of been in charge of the MERP program. So in Bristol's case, because you have a little bit more capacity and people that are interested, I'm not sure what I would recommend when you bring the select board in more formally and when you don't.
Well, the select board is here with Ian always.
So, but I don't know, when you want to start making formal requests and approval, that kind of conversation, I would have to process a little bit more and think about if you need guidance. But from the contractor perspective, I have a couple of questions also, but really, if there is anything structural being done to any of the buildings, if it's not just insulating and putting in heat pumps, then you kind of have to have an architect doing the drawings and approving the project, a certified professional in the field, making sure that that project is going to work. So
you said kinda, is it yes or no?
I mean, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so if we're talking, one of the big questions I have is if there are any accessibility projects related to these buildings, because we can apply for that work through the MERP program, but that is going to be structural work, and we would probably need to have, unless we're just talking about grab bars in the bathroom, if it's going to be a ramp, if it's going to be anything that people are standing on.
Fully accessible.
Okay, so that is the big kind of mental trigger for me.
In certain areas. Okay, I guess in terms of big picture, in terms of the funding, since we have these reports, is that a guarantee of funding depending on the projects that we pick? So how does that work?
Yeah, so
because that would be before any decision that the select board is making about this. Like, we have these assessments, there's a heck of a long list for each of those buildings, our 3 buildings, and obviously a high dollar figure attached to a lot of that. So select board's question would be like, where's that money coming from?
Yeah,
I can look at our capital building maintenance fund, and it's according to our last town report, it's $206,000. So there's not a tremendous amount in there. That's not going to cover anywhere near what's in this report. So
ideally, the money is coming from this MERP implementation grant. Bristol, because in 2019 you were on the high energy burden list, you're going to be pretty competitive for that grant. I don't have the grant guidance to tell you exactly what their scoring matrix is going to be, so I can't tell you where you are in that mix, but you're on the kind of better end of the spectrum for Addison County towns. So from that perspective, my focus right now is just getting us in a place where we feel comfortable applying for that implementation grant and talking about what work can we get funded through that program. the implementation grant is only gonna be $500,000 per town if they grant you anything. So that's where the town has to start making decisions on, are we going to focus on just one building and try and do as much as we can? Or are we gonna try and spread that money across multiple buildings? So that's one set of questions. And then you start talking about prioritizing types of projects. And so BGS will not, point blank statement, will not fund an EV charger before you have done weatherization and fuel switching and any kind of structural work you need to do. So, there's a kind of order of operations that they want to fund. So if you say we can use $100,000 to fix our envelope.
Yep.
And we also want to use another 50 grand to put a heat pump system in the whole building. And then we want to ask you for another 50 grand to maybe put solar on the roof. They might consider that, but you have to start with doing all the weatherization that you can, doing all the fuel switching that you can, and then we can get a little bit more ambitious with other things.
Mary, can you just outline then, so weatherization, you said fuel switching, and what are the other priorities? Like I assume these are kind of in the top tier, and then what else is in the top
other
tier?
things that tend to pop up depending on the building is things like swapping out windows. If your windows are really leaky, depending on if it's a historic building, that's a whole other conversation. Things like getting more ambitious with your ventilation system. It's not usually an energy conservation measure, but it does show up in these reports thanks to Act 174.
Right.
So those are going to be lower tier, lower interest projects from BGS's perspective because they're not doing the main goal of reducing your energy consumption.
Okay. Is there a match for any of this?
No.
Okay.
Nope.
So actually,
And we can use that funding as match for other programs. When I've pushed BGS, because it's state ARPA dollars, so it's not federal money yet, so we can use it as match against federal money.
Okay. Because the library, we have a grant that we've already submitted that we're waiting to hear back from.
Yeah, so that is the one program that BGS has guaranteed if you want to try and layer dollars that they will make it work with the library's capital funding. When I've pushed them on using it as match for other money, they start getting nervous about making guarantees. And I think they just don't want to get people wrapped into federalizing the MERP money if you don't have to. And we can talk about that.
Let me just ask you, because I went through, just taking Holly Hall as an example. The weatherization, energy conservation part is about $70,000. We've got heat pumps, we've got thermostats and stuff like that. That comes on only to about $132,000. Our total, if I follow through all of them, is $231,000. So it's conceivable that if we were to go through and say, yes, we want to do these projects as indicated, we've got an amount that falls far below the $500,000. And if Buildings and General Services accepts that, the town would not end up paying anything. And it would also, my understanding is the grant you applied for, if some of that project is done in this project, that money could be applied to other things.
Which the money for the library grant?
Yeah.
Potentially. I mean, it's a fairly big grant.
It's an interesting.
It's a mixture of things.
Yeah. But anyway, am I right in thinking we could go through each one of these and simply say, yeah, we'll do this? And we could certainly make arguments why we would do, let's say, heat pumps on the second floor of this building for resiliency and stuff like that.
So,
No,
yeah,
go
before
ahead.
you jump in, I just want to say these are engineers making estimates,
know.
they are not builders. And so Du Bois and King is local, and so I do have more faith in their numbers than some of our other vendors that we're working with from like Las Vegas. But I am, I am anticipating that we're gonna put a pretty good sized buffer on those numbers, and then we're gonna add another buffer for labor, and then
Right.
we're just gonna ask.
And does this include, like, you had indicated you'd need to have an architect? Well, does this include any of that?
No.
Right, so you got
Right.
that on
So,
top of it.
So we might not need an architect.
if you're just doing weatherization stuff, I don't think you would.
Yeah.
What about, the buildings that are on historic register, et cetera? I mean, that,
It would depend on the work. The
Yeah.
Historic Preservation Office at the state is already involved in developing the kind of grant guidance and application for this program. And so they have essentially said, here's our list of potential projects that might fall into our purview, and we're just gonna kind of rubber stamp it if you can mold what you're proposing to meet our kind of standards.
Yeah.
Is that mainly exterior or interior? Because I've heard that they're focused more on exterior of the building versus the interior.
Yeah, from what I understand, that's true.
Okay.
Really, they want these buildings to be functional, and so
Yeah.
when we're talking about weatherization, if you don't have to destroy, the old plaster and lath or the old
Yeah.
siding, they want you to do the work.
Yeah.
It gets a little fuzzy when it comes to windows and some of those finishes, because that is kind of what will qualify you for historic preservation money down the road. And so, they always say, unless you're on a register, if you're just an old building, you can do what you want,
Yeah.
but you're just making big decisions on what kind of funding you have access to in the future.
I mean, we're already on the register for all three of our buildings, I think.
Okay.
it's how to pause.
So,
Yeah.
Is there so let's say we have our cap, our 500,000, and you're saying we pick and choose what we want to do, focusing on those priority lists first. Does it work against us to focus on one building versus three? Or is it better to say we want to do all three buildings doing these things?
I don't think so, and I again don't have the guidance.
Yeah.
I wish I had clearer answers for you, but my understanding is that they are going to listen to the towns when the town says, this is what's gonna be best for us.
Okay.
So if you say, we wanna pour all of this money into Holly Hall, and it's going to get us to this great high standard of living in this space, I don't think that they're gonna have any questions about that. But just to finish my point about costs, my goal is to have at the minimum a couple of workshops in August and early September for folks to come in and sit down with their reports with a couple of engineers and architects and general contractors to kind of gut check the numbers at the very minimum. For my high energy burden towns, there's 6 of you. And so I'm trying to figure out a way to contract with an architectural firm on behalf of all 6 of those towns to go through the reports and start the process of doing the as-built and doing a structural assessment and having a conversation about, is there other work that we are talking about here, or is this just an energy retrofit?
So is that somebody other than Du Bois and King?
It might be Du Bois and King, so we would have to put out an RFP and
Right.
solicit responses. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Shelley Pottorf over at Millward College, but she's been chatting with me about what I should be including and not including given the time frame. So my goal is to try and provide some resources to help make at minimum the application a little bit clearer, so that we're not asking for $250,000 and then we end up needing $400,000. Because what I don't want to have happen is towns applying for money, getting money, and then not being able to use it
Not
to
finished.
complete a project.
So for us to go down the list and identify some contractors and ask them to give us bids on this,
Mhm.
would that be a mistake?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think
Would it speed it up? Would it get in the way?
Premature, yeah.
and it sounds like you're telling me you don't think that you have anything beyond your energy efficiency project here. So I think in this case,
if that's the case.
Yeah, if that's the case, then I don't see any reason why you shouldn't start having those conversations. And
Come
if,
up with our numbers.
right,
But David is an architect.
Okay.
And so his expertise is really important.
Well, I was just wondering, so a couple things. So the library project might, because what the scope of the work for this grant may include things that aren't like changing uses of rooms.
There's
and-
overlap, and,
Yeah, and so that is not part of this, per
Right.
se, but if we're sort of coordinating with that, will that, I mean, it seems like maybe we'll need an architect for that, but
sounds
maybe.
like, yeah,
maybe.
my understanding is that
Yeah.
you would want to have an architect on board for that scale of a project anyways, just to keep things organized and kind of out of the hands of town volunteers and staff.
Right.
And if we can fund that kind of planning and project development work through the MERP project and still get the energy efficiency benefits, I think BGS would be ecstatic about that. You know, I don't think that there's an issue there. It is one of the costs that we can apply for.
When we do projects in the town, like on a building, who project manages that?
generally we hire.
We hire
somebody,
somebody.
depending on what it is. We haven't done buildings in a while. It's mainly infrastructure projects like water, sewer, and things like that, on roads.
So then the departments would project manage it themselves?
No, it would still be if we
Hire
hired it
someone,
out.
okay.
I mean, even for the library, which has some structural things, not structural, but things that are changing, that's probably on a smaller scale. So I don't know. I mean, it depends. It depends what we focus on from these reports and what we feel. I think we should be able to go through and determine perhaps if an architect is needed to sort of look at certain things. But there aren't a lot of changes in terms of structural changes to the building. So it's mainly you're sort of focusing on tightening up everything, which is, you know, essentially drilling holes and filling those holes in with cellulose or whatever. And then installing certain systems, which would be more contractors, you know, plumbers and things like that.
Yeah, it might get more complicated if we were talking about a ducted heat pump system.
Right,
In that
right.
case, you'd want an engineer on board, you know, so
Right.
there's,
Engineer versus architect, I guess.
Right,
Yeah, I
so-
think we need to
But there's always-
vet all of those.
And there's always
those
instances when you
recommendations.
start doing stuff.
Yes.
What if you find something
That's correct.
that you don't
Yeah.
expect?
Yeah, it'd be more engineering, I feel, than architect, but
Mhm.
I guess it depends as we go through. For the library project, so it's 483,000, that's what that grant is for.
Okay.
And it does cover, that's why I asked for these MERP reports before they were done to sort of give us an idea. And we've talked to 3 different contractors, plumbing and heating experts that are getting us information about their thoughts based on MERP and what they were saying and based on what these contractors are saying. So there's overlap with that. What's the deadline for this? We're waiting about maybe 3 to 6 weeks. Perhaps we'll hear, the grant administrator and the library director had a call with this group, which is the, what's it again? It's the US Treasury Capital Projects Grant. So they had a call, and essentially they are checking in to see, like, do you still need this money? Have you started this project? What's going on? So they gave their answers. They didn't really allude to whether we are going to receive it or not. It's very competitive, similar to this. But it's, you know, it all seems pretty positive. So what's the overlap in terms of deadline?
yeah, so I
Since we're waiting to hear back on this, it'd be great to be able to use 480,000 of this and not,
Right.
and some of these library improvements are in this project and we only have to focus on a third of those, or maybe none, because this covers everything.
Yeah.
Or do we do less of this, maybe, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, my recommendation, because the state has said, we, the libraries department and BGS will figure out how this money overlaps once we've got both applications in the door. I don't really know how that's gonna look. So my recommendation is take as much money as you can from the library's grant. And if we're lucky enough to also get MERP funding, we'll just figure out how that layers in. What was I going to say beyond that?
You're gonna talk about the deadline.
The deadline. So we think it's going to be September, October.
Okay.
probably end of September is going to be their preferred deadline because they need to prove to the legislature that they've got enough uptake in this program so that they don't claw back funding.
Yeah.
So,
Let's get it in
Okay.
soon.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Tell
So-
everyone else to get it in.
yeah.
so I think end of
Fair
September
enough.
is going to be the deadline, but they did say that there might be some second round
Okay.
shenanigans if folks are desperate and high energy burden towns didn't get their applications in on time.
So, Ian, in your mind, for efficiency, how should we work together?
Well, I think we need to get Frida involved, our grant administrator, because she's gonna be spearheading this.
Okay.
And then she would request of us what's needed. So I don't know, is the application available? When does that become available? So she could look and see what we need.
Supposed to be available this month.
Okay,
So we should have a couple of months to kind of figure out how we want to word everything. Essentially, the application, and I have not seen the final version, but they have been telling us from the beginning that the application is going to be a combination of what do you want out of your report? Give us the price tag and tell us why the building matters to the community. You know, there's going to be a narrative piece about the value of the building, but most of the concrete stuff is going to come straight out of the report. If we don't agree with the report, if we think that the costs are going to be greater and those costs are not, like if the buffer that we are allowed to add to these numbers isn't enough to cover whatever that greater estimate is going to be, then we have the opportunity to submit, well, we had a general contractor look at this project and they're telling us the cost is going to be X, Y, and Z. Here's the documentation. So we do have a chance to go outside the report if we need to, but the straight and narrow application is going to be mostly tell us what the report said.
So in the application, are the reports included in the report, in the application?
They are going to ask you to submit the report. I
Okay.
think.
So if there are things in the report, let's say, for instance, they talked about, you know, the sort of the life expectancy of the, let's say, the oil furnace, and they'll say, or oiler, and they'll say that it has, you know, it's 17 years old or something like that.
Right.
And they'll say it's a life expectancy of 25 years. And so they didn't include switching it out with a propane model or something like that. If we decide, the town feels that, you know, it's a goal to do this fuel switching and reduce our, you know, fossil fuel load, how does that, I mean, could we go, I guess I'm saying, could we go beyond the report? Could we say,
Yeah,
you
so
know,
I
we
think-
have the money now, let's just do it now because we'll have to do it in 7 years.
Right.
I mean,
And then we might not have the money.
Most of the reports.
Well, we might have.
Right.
Yeah.
Most of the reports, and I can't remember all of the details
Yeah.
from all of yours, but most of the reports, they have to give you a couple of alternative fuel switching options.
Yeah,
That's
they-
part of the structure. So,
Yeah.
so if they're saying, well, we don't really recommend it, but here's what the outcome would be if you put in a heat pump system today, you know, the payback would be 15
Yeah,
years
yeah.
instead of the preferred 7 to 5. The town can still say, well, we did all our weatherization. We think that the cost of the heat pump will be cheaper because it's gonna be a smaller system when you look at it again, once we've done all that weatherization. And it's your money, so we would really like to spend it on having a heat pump system rather than having to deal with this fossil fuel system going forward.
We're also talking about resiliency, warming and cooling centers. So that would be part of
That
my
would be-
rationale.
Good part of the narrative to add is to say,
And
you know,
make-
we're not,
make the
well, and
upstairs usable.
in my
Yeah.
mind, this is a good opportunity if you've got, you know, 10 years left on a furnace to have that heat pump, to get everybody familiar with how they work as a layer on your heating system, rather than saying, we're gonna pull out a furnace and just hope that a heat pump functions
Yeah, we
enough
wouldn't
for
do
this
that.
To
space.
do a backup, have
Yeah,
it as your
to
backup.
have it
Yeah.
kind of as
Yeah.
a paired system rather
Yes,
than
right.
Yeah, I think
doing
hybrid
both
is-
projects at once.
You gotta go.
So they've called it, so most of instances, they identify it as the heat pump oil hybrid.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
it's right here.
And so
Yeah.
we, you know, so I think one question would be, you know, why go with this oil hybrid, you know, maybe we want to do this with that. You know, we maybe want to replace that boiler now with a gas fired.
Well, I don't think,
Yeah.
so one of the tricky pieces with working with multiple vendors and BGS and the RPCs in the towns is that the communication has not always been the clearest. And some vendors understood their requirements to be that they cannot recommend a fossil fuel burning fuel switch option. And some vendors, Devine King being one of them, said, well, if it's a more efficient fossil fuel system, then we can include it. I don't think BGS is going to fund a fossil fuel switch.
Great.
So they're not going to help you install a new propane
Yeah.
boiler
Oh,
or
okay.
furnace.
Okay, well, that's good
So
to know.
glad, so
Yeah.
glad to hear that. That's
Yeah,
what I was-
so
Okay,
if you want to leave your furnace in place and add a heat pump system, I think that's a conversation we can have, but I don't think that they're going to
I
fund
can't say,
a new
Makes
furnace.
sense,
Okay.
you know, and then down the road, you know, if half the town wants to put in that on a new one, once the other one dies, then we.
Well, and you know, you
Well, there may be
have
other
the
options,
next
who knows?
7
There
to
might
10
be other
years
routes.
of the furnace operating at a much smaller scale, and you can say,
Yeah,
well,
you
we
get
need a really
longer.
smaller system now.
Yeah,
right, right.
and it might last a lot longer than it would have.
Really gonna need that backup system for like 4% of the entire year, you know? When basically when it's like 20 below or something.
Right, yeah.
The other question I guess I had is, it sounds like this is probably gonna be no, but we can't have like alternates where we say, we have enough money. We still have enough money, can we do this too? Or, I mean, within the report, I mean, can we, like, I guess we're saying, I guess what I'm saying is, can we prioritize, let's say, we're gonna prioritize the envelope, building envelope. And maybe some of the other things we may like to do, or it would be desirable to do, but maybe the envelope is more important than some of the, let's say, lighting upgrades
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah, so I think, tell me if I'm misunderstanding your question, but I think if you run through the full gamut of air sealing, insulation, you get all your lights upgraded to LEDs, and then you say, well, we've got another $100,000 left in what we can ask for. We're gonna ask for that solar field, or we're gonna ask for that EV charger or the storage in the building. Those are things that BGS will consider once you've done everything else. But they also, I think, are going to reserve the right to say, we will fund the first $400,000 of this project, but we're not gonna give you the money for that solar.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, so I think they're going to be willing to work with us a little bit.
And they see the battery backup, even though we're saying that it's gonna provide us this resiliency, that's still a lower priority than, let's say, weatherization.
Yeah, so I think the battery backup, if we're gonna make the narrative case that, you know, this is gonna be a resilience hub and we need that backup storage, I think it probably would take precedent over maybe even Windows, but it's not gonna do better than weatherization and air sealing and fuel switching.
There were a couple installation things that said maybe it wasn't as, you know, important to do.
Right.
Yeah,
Like,
that's
in
it,
the
yeah.
library, that like,
Yeah.
it's gonna be a huge project to try to deal with that, historic building, all that. And, so is it best not to do that and do other things, or, you know?
I think it depends on the cost, and that's where having somebody who does weatherization projects come in and gut check the report
Okay.
and say, well, I mean, I've done this on a building before, and you can
Yeah.
kind of get in there.
It's really not that, you know.
Right, or
yeah, it's,
no, this is gonna be 10 times more expensive than they're giving you
Yeah.
right there, and that's not
Yeah.
worth the benefit. You know, I think those are, that kind of documentation is the kind of additional stuff that we would like to be able to provide in the application to kind of explain, well, we skipped this weatherization item because it's not feasible, and we're still gonna ask for money to do the other things.
Like this one is 11,000, payback 36 years.
Yeah,
You know, and it's gonna be a really hard job or something they said in there, like,
Right.
this is a crazy
Yeah.
job, you know, no one wants to do this job.
Yeah, I was just reading a report that was like, well, you could insulate the slab, but you'd have to dig down 3 feet
Yeah.
around the whole
Right.
building and you'd have to pull up pavement. So we're not recommending
Yeah.
it, but this is what you could do if you were trying to be overachieved. Yeah, so, you know, there are situations like that where I think, first of all, the fact that they put it in the report with that kind of language
Yeah.
gives you some defense, but
Yeah.
it's also helpful to have somebody who
Yeah,
might
this-
actually do the
This one
project.
in the library. The one Sal was talking about.
Yeah.
I guess the question is, here's the opportunity now.
Mhm.
Should we go ahead and do all the weatherization that can be done, get it done,
And envelope.
and then
Insulation.
it's finished?
I mean, that would be my personal recommendation. I've almost told people, just stop looking at the payback line.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
You know, if we were
Yeah.
talking
Yeah.
about spending the town's funds on this, I would have more concern for that, but
Yeah.
This is,
given
yeah,
that this is a grant funding, there's no match
Yeah.
involved. This is going to improve the comfort and the longevity of the
Yeah.
building.
Yeah.
I would
Why not
rather.
do it?
okay,
Yeah.
great.
Well,
Let's use
and
this
that's
knowledge to do that
interesting, and I think we'll probably talk about this maybe a little later about the questions we have and how we would, submit those questions or get input. But a lot of the questions, and I was looking at them this morning, a lot of the questions have to do with the payback part. Because, some of the paybacks don't really make sense. I mean, and they'll have like heat pumps that last 15 years and they'll say the payback is, 40 years or 36 years.
Yeah.
You're like, well,
Wait a minute.
you'll have to have two of those
It'll
before
be a new
you
building
figure out
by
the,
then.
yeah, so I think, maybe a lot, if we don't look at those, maybe a lot of these, a third of these questions go away, because I think, it's like, well, did you look at, what if we did insulate? Let's say, what would the payback for that be, or whatever? So if we're not really worried about that and we want to just do the right thing,
Yeah.
and we think we have enough money to do it, I think maybe
Right.
we'll just, sort of like take that out of our mind a little bit. I mean, it's still good
Yeah.
for, it's good in general for looking at, especially with the really, low payback, like 6-year, 4-year, it's just like a no-brainer anyway.
Right.
But I was wondering if we had to, sort of have the due diligence, like say, if someone's gonna say, well, why are you doing that when it's a 4-year payback?
And I mean,
type thing?
BGS might come back and say that, but because I don't have the guidance in front of me, I can't tell you exactly one way or the other. From what I've heard from them, their priority is getting these buildings really weatherized, really
Okay.
tight.
Yeah.
And everything else is just gravy on top. So if it's in the weatherization section and it says the payback's gonna be 35 years, we can have that conversation with BGS. The other thing that I've been noticing with some of my towns is in the building occupancy, the way that they calculate their payback period is based on your occupancy and your use of the building. And so for some towns, the person who gave those numbers in the moment will look at them after the fact and be like, oh, we use that building twice as much. I wasn't
Yeah.
thinking right.
Yeah.
So if we need to adjust those numbers,
I mean,
that's
3 people
another.
in the library, well, but not when all the kids are there for
Well,
story hour.
Every time I go in, there are kids there.
I know. I looked at those too, and I thought the same thing. It's like, oh boy, I mean, what about, this building?
Right.
And like right now, we have
Yeah.
more people in this room than they have for the whole building, in their general occupancy.
And they said an average of like 4 or something, didn't they?
Yeah, something like 4,
So
yeah.
that is one thing that we can request of the vendors. I don't know if they're gonna be able to find the time in the next month or 2 to do that, but that is something that I've been suggesting to towns. If you really don't like your payback of 130 years, maybe we should go back and look at what the initial calculation was using.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not just your town clerk in the library and the
Yeah,
big old building all day.
yeah.
But it also may not matter.
Right.
Because,
Yeah.
we can plug our own numbers in there and that would change the payback, but if we ignore that and we
If we're
do
gonna
that,
ignore
well,
it, yeah.
insulating is the right thing to do. If
Right.
air is leaking out, if cold air is coming in,
Right.
it's a good thing to insulate as much as
Yeah.
possible. And then and then you're able to use systems that perhaps need as tight an envelope as possible for the building to be able to work, especially heat pumps. I mean, if you don't insulate, then it's just like passing through the walls and not doing anything.
100%. It's like the first thing you do is the envelope, because what's gonna happen is that then all of a sudden those systems, like if you're gonna go with a heat pump system, that actually reduces the possibility that you're even gonna use this backup system. So maybe the oil,
Yeah.
burning furnace or boiler
Yeah.
doesn't ever get used, or, ideally,
Right.
that would be great.
Yeah, if we
that
can
was
make the
really
buildings
true,
tight
or
enough to
very,
just
very
not
little.
use the secondary system.
then we definitely have to put in a special heat exchanger system, when we have it that tight,
Yeah, the ERVs.
yeah, because then it's like,
On this ventilation.
yeah, you have to put it.
Well, I don't
You
know.
just type it.
And
I don't know if you, well, you can tighten it up, but you're never gonna get as tight where you might need it. Down here, we have one. It's part of, it was part of the renovation. There's an HRV. Upstairs, I guess you could get it tight, but I don't know, unless you're doing spray foam.
Yeah, it'd be tough, because you got the whole open.
Yeah,
up
and you have the windows and stuff, but
But
every
like library or
building is
house.
obviously, library
Well,
definitely, they're looking at that. That was part of our discussion with the vendors.
Yeah.
The contractors just sort of like, how can we get air exchange in here, mainly for safety, things like that.
Right. And actually, it's interesting, Maddie, you were talking about ventilation is down the, down the list, I guess. It does actually, there is, and actually it's mentioned in the report, if there's an energy penalty for this heat, like doing a ventilation system,
Yeah.
that you're gonna lose heat,
Right,
because
taking heat
you're
out from
constantly,
your-
yeah.
Bringing cold air.
Or you're using
but
it
it's
as
still-
more the electrical demand of the
Yeah.
system itself.
Fan.
Yeah,
But so
you're taking heated air and you're
that's where
Yeah.
taking some of it
a
out.
closer look at Act 174 itself, rather than what BGS has said to us, is valuable, because Act 174 was built as a COVID response law first and foremost. And so the one thing that they knew they were going to fund was actually ventilation systems and
Okay.
HVAC systems, because it was a community health question.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So ventilation is not usually in the list of energy conservation measures, because it is usually an actual addition of energy use.
Right. Penalty, yeah.
And it's not something that's traditionally in these reports outside of the MERP program, but it is here because of Act 174. And they usually add a little narrative saying, well, this is an energy use, but it helps
Good
by
thing.
X, Y, and Z. And if you tighten the building enough, then you do need it for safety. But I don't see many people saying they think these historic buildings are gonna get that tight without a lot of work.
Yeah.
So,
That's a good
But
thing.
that's
to
it.
change in your building.
Yeah.
Would we be worried about upstairs, like a town meeting day and plays and all sorts of, events that might be there? Is that a?
No, I think the main thing upstairs would be heat pumps or some sort of system where you could cool the space and have it be. I mean, it's obviously.
You don't think the ventilation is an issue?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you could put in, similar to the library that we discussed, like how would, like you can drill through the wall and put in a system that's pulling in air and saving a little bit of heat as it goes out. So you could do those, but then you're changing what it looks like outside, so then we have a problem with that.
Yeah, got a lot of those.
But we have access to the attic space upstairs, so you could do systems that are pulling in and have ERVs is what they're recommending, is what the contractor said. And so you're capturing some of that heat that you're losing, hopefully not, as if you're bringing in 10-degree air, you're not blowing 10-degree air on into the space, you're blowing maybe 60-degree air because it's captured it. But that means other things will need to be working harder. The cooling is, I think, is the main thing. The heating, you're using more resources to heat that space, but there's no way to cool it at all. Especially on days like this, and get that humidity down.
yeah, the moisture is a problem.
Yeah.
Remind me, did we have any concerns about material contamination in any of your buildings?
I don't think so.
Okay, there's no lead or asbestos in any of
I don't think it was in the report. I don't know if there is.
Yeah, they wouldn't have it in the report.
No.
I don't believe so. I think each building has been renovated at some point where I think that those issues have been mitigated, I believe. I don't know for certain.
If it becomes a question when we've thought about it for a minute, we do have at the RPC a brownfields program that'll let us do whatever the assessment is of the building. I'm blanking on the term, but so we can come in and do some of those assessments for free for these towns. It's just a matter of if we think we need it or not.
Well, given that they went all through these buildings, Du Bois and King wouldn't have mentioned anything to us
I mean, if
about those?
they found vermiculite, or what
Yes.
they thought was vermiculite in any of the insulation, they wouldn't have done the blower door test. So I
Okay.
think we're probably
Yeah.
okay. Lead is a little bit harder for
Yeah.
somebody to just pick out of the
Yeah.
wall, but yeah, so there
Yeah,
are
I
some
think they've been
buildings
repainted
that,
and scraped and probably mitigated of those issues over time, especially the lead thing.
um,
Asbestos. and
They-
heights. And
Yeah,
Floor tiles.
They talk about
Or-
vengeance,
Yeah,
they talk about venting stuff in, for Holly Hall, but, so, you know, vent through the chimney, dedicated combustion air supply fan. Blah, blah.
we do have
I mean,
that.
they're-
I mean, that is,
yeah.
Okay, that's what's already there, okay. All right,
yeah,
And some of the things that they listed, like the battery, you know, I
Yeah.
know there are sort of new regulations coming in for that in terms of being inside buildings and you need your sort of separate room for them. I know that other towns are sort of making decisions about that, how those are applied in each town, and I don't know what Bristol, we haven't talked about that at the select board level. And then the charging, I know that's way down the list, but I think we don't need to look at that because we put in for a grant for level 3 charging. And they're just, for level 2, I don't think it's suitable, and we don't have really suitable locations anyway.
right.
So I think we can just sort of nix that on those reports. I mean, it's good to have it, but we're looking at other areas.
We can justify putting some level 2s behind apartment buildings. It's part of this,
Behind the apartment buildings, probably not,
yeah.
but if it's off the property.
Yeah.
I don't see that they are saying anything about heat pumps for here. You know, we've got heat pumps down here, and the upper part, I don't think there's any.
This part
Oh, yeah,
has
there
heat
is.
pumps.
Really?
Yeah,
And all
yeah.
that.
Yeah, where
Yeah,
do they
yeah.
have them showing it?
Is the, yeah.
I mean, I was reading and didn't think of.
So, so we're back, or I'd like to dial back to the questions.
Building
We have all
heating
these
is page
questions,
27. supposedly.
and then maybe we would vet through these again, especially if, on the issues of payback and all that. But is it, I know that you had voiced some concern about the sort of overwhelming the vendor with questions, and I was even thinking, you know, there are some things I think require clarity, but we could, I mean, I don't know if we, you know, if we really are trying to avoid, you know, contact, getting back to them. I guess we could just do our best, but
Right.
I'm
Well, so
wondering, you know,
there-
could it be like a short meeting or a phone call or something?
Yeah, I
don't
mean,
know, but-
there are just a couple of layers, and this isn't necessarily true of Bristol, but I find in different towns, we have different levels of like activist town members, and so
Mm,
BGS has made it very clear to me that we should not be contacting vendors more than one time after we receive a report. So if we have feedback, or we have concerns about the reports themselves,
Okay.
we can put those together in a document, send it over, and get their response. My interpretation of what I've seen from other towns is that about half of the questions tend to be more about the program and what BGS is doing and what's coming. And the vendor is just not gonna know the answers to those questions. So I try to get in front of you before you
Yeah.
talk to them, just because they didn't even know that there was a grant after the assessment until very recently. And so they're kind of, they were hired for this one purpose, and that's the only purpose. And so, yeah. So I'm happy to try and figure out which of these questions I can answer or BGS
Okay.
can answer, and then,
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't recall anything about the program at all. I mean, I didn't ask those questions. I don't know if anyone else has issues about or questions about the program, but most of these are we did as a committee, but most of them are authored by myself. And I'm thinking maybe our committee will go through and sort of vet through those again and make some, maybe some changes and then get them back to you. I think, did you see that you've seen?
I don't think I
You might have seen
did.
this.
I think I was out of the loop for an email or
Okay,
two.
yeah,
Have
that might have
all
been
of us
true.
seen it, or just you three? I don't know if I've seen it.
I might have I don't know if I CC'd you or not on that, but
Okay.
anyway, yeah, so so I know to Ben
Maybe I
and,
did, maybe I did.
yeah, I'm not sure you were on there.
Yeah, why don't
so-
you
Yeah, it'd
CC
be
and
great to
then maybe
have us-
Maddie too,
you
just to
tuned
get
in.
Yeah,
a sense of it.
do you want it in the current form, or you mean the revised?
Whatever you
Yeah.
feel comfortable with. I'm happy to.
Yeah,
walk
I would
through
do the
it.
revised, because
Yeah, we'll do
the
we're
revised.
not, some of your
Yeah.
questions were pertinent to the payback.
Yeah,
And they could come back and readjust, but I don't think,
Yeah,
given that
let's
it's
just get
not,
it short.
yeah, it's not the town money, not that we're just needlessly spending, but we know internally that even if it's a longer payback, we know that these steps, especially the installation side, is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And so regardless of the numbers that they approve, we know that buildings are much higher use, maybe not Howden Hall, but especially this building and the library than what they've said, so we know that those numbers, those payback years should be shorter in terms of if it's calculated by person or occupancy.
Okay.
Payback?
Yeah, we'll do this. We'll do
It's
the,
just, the more you use the building, the faster the payback is,
Okay.
generally.
Okay.
But yeah, so I don't know if there are a couple of questions that are burning that we want to talk about now, but I'm happy to review them.
I wouldn't say burning, except in general about payback, but
Yeah.
that we're gonna sort of dispense with that, but, there were just a lot of clarity. Questions like some things were recommended and then I didn't see them in the actual ECMs. But they, and I thought, well, maybe it's in there somewhere, but it's in one of the categories that I'm not really feeling like I know where it is.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly what you're thinking of, but generally like the ventilation projects, the storage, the EV chargers, and the solar are all going to be things that are included in the reports, but are not going to end up on the ECM list because they're not actually part of a normal ASHRAE level 2 audit. And so the vendors were just asked to kind of add it to
Oh, really?
the back of to kind of append that to make the assessments beefier. So that's why you won't see them in the nice chart,
Right,
but you will see them talked about.
Right.
Yeah, but it's just an Act
I noticed that
174.
across the board, the circulator motors in all the buildings.
Oh, yeah.
It should be just.
It's in every
But
building.
the cost doesn't show up here, and I know they're pricey.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if we want to have that conversation with BGS in the application, then trying to find somebody who
Yeah.
can give you a quote for
Yeah.
those would be valuable.
How many towns are we competing with?
Well, 150
Oh,
or
is
so.
that
So I think when we got the assessment done, or all of the applications in and all of them approved, there was something like 600 buildings had applied for assessments. Probably about 300 of those have actually gotten assessments and were granted assessments. In Addison County, there are 6 towns that are kind of in your playing field. So from what I understand of the law that is guiding their kind of decision matrix, it is energy burden, geographic distribution, town capacity are the kind of 3 big factors beyond just the quality of the application that it's going to decide who gets what money.
What would town capacity be?
So in that regard, Bristol is probably not as competitive because
Right.
they're trying to talk to towns that have like a half-time town
Yeah.
clerk and doesn't have any capacity to do building projects on their own.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of towns in Addison County that probably look better in that perspective. What
Like they
BGS
don't have capacity, so they need help.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and I like that this program is trying to do that. It
Yeah.
just means that, we would have to make a better pitch.
Yeah.
However, when BGS has talked to us about this program, the only factor that they've ever really talked about has been energy burden. And Bristol does come in kind of in the high energy burden bracket. There is a highest energy burden bracket. There aren't any of those towns in Addison County. They almost all show up in the NEK. If we were just going by energy burden, all of the money would be in the NEK and none of us would see any money. I don't think that they can do that. Right. I don't think that they're going to do that because of that geographic distribution clarifier, but
I was gonna ask you to clarify that. The geographic distribution is just sort of like,
they don't
there's
want.
no money going to Addison, so
Right.
we.
They're gonna
or maybe
distribute it
potentially, yeah,
Right, so I think they're gonna try and make sure that
Everybody.
communities of a similar burden level across the state see some money.
Mhm.
When you do the math, if everybody was asking for the maximum amount of dollars for that full $500,000, you get about 70 grants across the state. So it depends on if BGS is going to prefer to grant the maximum amount, or if they want to try and spread dollars. Or if we all kind of just force them by only asking for $250,000. But so that there is some gaming of the grant system that we'll have to kind of strategize over once we get the guidance.
Yeah.
But
Are we-
there is.
Yeah, right.
So you said 300 buildings, are we competing against 300 buildings, or are we competing against 6 in Addison County?
I think you're competing against the whole state. I think that geographic distribution gives you a bump up because we are then kind of reducing the window to Addison County.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is going to do for you.
Okay.
And you're not competing against 300 buildings, you're competing against whatever 100 towns that
choices
have all of those buildings.
Okay.
Yeah, so it gets a little bit complicated, and I don't know that BGS has fully wrapped their heads around how complicated this
Yeah,
program
yeah.
is. They're just kind of building it as they go, and so we're
Yeah.
all.
Are they gonna look at, if we submit priority lists, will they go down? Or do they wanna just have bulk figures?
So my understanding, and again, I haven't seen the final application, but my understanding is that they're gonna have kind of buckets. So they're gonna say, how many dollars do you want for weatherization on this building? How many dollars do you want for fuel switching? How many dollars do you want for air sealing? How many,
Okay.
And they want you to be able to point to where those numbers are coming from in the report, but they're gonna give you kind of big buckets of money. And again, they're gonna prefer that you spend most of your dollars on those first couple of
Yep.
priorities, but you know, if you get to the end of that line and you say, well, based on everything we have, we've got some money left over. If you wanna give us the maximum amount, we could really use that EV charger outside.
Right.
You know, that is when the guidance is gonna change what the kind of
So
application.
will the guidance tell us how to fill out the application so that we know what the buckets are?
Yeah, I mean,
I
the
mean, would
the
they want us to
application,
organize it that way?
no, I think the application is going to give you kind of those line items.
Okay.
And we're just gonna fill it in, I think.
Okay.
From what I've seen, they're doing a kind of fancy Google form as the application. They're trying to keep it really low tech, really low administrative burden for the actual application. So we're just gonna go in, fill out our form based on what the report says, add our little narrative, and send it off. That is the promise that I have been given.
Can I have Frida get in contact with you so we
Yeah,
can get
absolutely.
information about it? Okay.
Yeah, and I plan to do a big round of blast emails when I get all of that guidance and
Okay.
the application for sure. I would just say, I want to caution everyone from applying too fast when we see the application.
Okay.
And really take the time to get a couple of external quotes, have a conversation with some contractors, make sure that we're not asking for the wrong number of dollars.
Yeah,
Got
that's
it.
great.
Okay.
Yeah, because I don't think that there's going to be like a first come, first serve
Oh.
aspect of this grant. It's going to be,
Collect
There'll be a
all of that,
deadline.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good,
so,
good.
So getting contractors to get
I
more
think-
quotes
I
is
think we-
number one. Yeah.
Certainly ought to recommend we get some contractors on these things. Get the numbers.
well, that is, so one of my missions in talking to you today is to get an idea of if the RPC were going to fund a pre-implementation application, work with an architect or engineer. If we wanted to put in an RFP in the next week or so, is that something that Bristol wants to be part of? Or is that something that you guys think you can just go ahead and manage on your own?
I'd probably put in for that.
I think it's a really good call.
Because I think if we're looking at these 3 buildings, I mean, with that, we can include all 3 and just sort of decide what we might want to have done. And that would prepare us potentially for the library grant. If we get that, fingers crossed, we'd have a lot of that information ready to go
Yeah.
in terms of.
Essentially, what I'm trying to do is get at least my highest energy burden towns, a contractor or an architect, an engineer that they have already met before they've got this big pile of money, and
Yeah.
everybody else has a big pile of money, and we're trying to compete for the 5 architects that do this work
Right.
Yeah.
regularly. So that's what I am mostly concerned about, is getting you a little bit of guidance ahead of time,
Yeah,
but mostly having somebody kind of on retainer going into
Yeah.
that funding.
I mean, because if we don't do that, then it's just, we're essentially calling around different contractors who do installation and see if we can get quotes. And we got quotes from 3 vendors, and we met with them, but we still don't have those quotes yet because they're so busy and that's such a low priority for them. Like,
Yeah.
we could really struggle just getting people here to look at these reports and say, hey, this is what we'd like to have done.
Yeah.
So I think this seems like a higher level, but that might help us more in the long run.
I agree with that.
Are we
Maybe it could be a
agreed?
lot of work to try to,
Yeah.
for us to pull those together and then, try to, I can just tell you, just getting contractors together, call you back is so
Yeah.
difficult.
So you're saying
Vendors, whatever.
Patty,
yeah.
at RPC,
Yeah, so I'll include the Bristol
That's
buildings in the.
What is it?
That's
What is
great.
it?
So
RCP is,
Regional Planning Commission?
oh, I'm sorry. Oh, but what is the, no, I understand that. What is the, what
The
is
grant or
the
that.
grant
that program.
called? What is this grant called? Or
I think we're just calling it the implementation grant for
Implementation
the
grant.
MERP
Okay,
program.
implementation.
Yeah, I don't think.
Is there a
we're
matching? What have you got? Is there a match for that in terms of the town?
No.
Okay.
No, so,
Even
yeah,
better.
we're trying to
Yeah, that's
use
just
our
something.
admin funds, because they gave us, Act 174 gave the RPCs funding to
Okay.
help you all, and I don't really see a better use of that money.
Yeah.
Because I'm not an expert builder, and so.
Not yet, anyway.
So I've learned a lot reading all these reports, but
Right.
I can't tell you, well, they're recommending R49 in the attic, but really R60 would be better
Right.
because of whatever structural
Yeah.
situation you've got going on.
Mm.
So that's just not what I am here for. And so I would rather spend that money on somebody else's time to help you all do that more valuable work.
Great, that's awesome.
That's cool.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't, the scope of that, since these reports are huge, but really, we're only focusing on a couple of sections of them. The scope isn't enormous. I mean, insulating is the biggest thing, and so that
And
can be done,
ceiling.
that can be done by.
Boils down to a couple of pages.
Right,
really.
that can be done by a single contractor, I mean, if they know what they're doing for all 3 of the buildings in terms of looking at different seals and stuff like that. I guess the bigger thing is switching fuel sources and what that means. I think maybe the energy committee needs to look at that further and just to sort of decide like what direction, I mean, and that's part of that is the payback too, because some of those were just ridiculous amounts of time for payback, regardless of how many people are using the building.
What work on that were you thinking of bringing in heat pumps instead of fuel switching? Like putting in a whole new gas thing, use what we have, use the heat pump and working together and not.
Well, it depends what you want to do, right? So if you fuel switch to something that's more environmentally friendly and economical,
Like,
it still doesn't solve problems of cooling the space
Right.
upstairs,
Right.
right? And the library looked at the same thing. It has an oil, so we're going to switch to gas, but you have to put in a propane tank back there, but then that still is just heating.
Yeah.
So
and the
it's not
oil
cool.
actually, when they looked at it a couple of years ago, they said that was good to go for a while. And then lately, the person who went in and said, oh no, you can switch that out. So I really, like Matt said, this is a good system. It doesn't need to be replaced. So I'm wondering, we're getting different messages.
Well, I think it's also the environmental impact of the oil versus the propane.
Yeah.
So propane is cleaner.
Yeah. But when I get
And
heat pumps and
cheaper.
use them together until that boiler is really done and then switch out.
Yeah, I'm not
Like
saying
why,
for the
why switch
library.
out one?
Right, no, and
Yeah.
but that's the conversation.
Oh,
we
yeah,
have,
some of
right?
them,
We
yeah.
look at all, because they have multiple recommendations, and some of them are like pellet boilers and things like that, and we know that there's no way that you could even fit something like that in there. You have to completely adapt the building.
Yeah, and they cited some of those,
Yeah.
sort of those
And
conflicts.
there's also definite controversy about how.
There is.
But something like the
I don't
library,
want to get into that.
we looked at the oil tank is super old, so we know that it's
The
sitting in
oil
there.
tank,
Oil
yeah,
tank
yeah, yeah.
inside the building is super old, and the library needs space. So it
Yeah.
makes sense, the concept of like, okay, you
Okay.
would switch to propane to
Okay.
heat your same system and your same boiler, but the fuel source changes out. You can
Okay,
move
I
that
see what
thing
you're
out of
saying.
there, that opens up space,
Okay,
but then you're putting something on the exterior of the building. So for something like that, you can make a case for switching to a
Okay.
different fuel. Others perhaps not.
Yeah.
Like this building, maybe you would look at that in a different way.
Should
yeah.
should we even mess with the battery backup in terms of where would they go in these buildings? How
I mean, I think if it were 3 years ago, before people started getting nervous about fires related to battery systems, it would be a
Yeah,
different
right.
conversation.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
But maybe you don't need battery backup for Houghton Hall.
Well, we,
Down the
yeah,
road maybe, but we
Yeah, I
can deal with
agree.
it down the road. The next
Yeah.
grant that comes
do
3
we want
years.
to, do we want
yeah, I mean, I
to
think
mess with it?
if you have money left in the $500,000 and you want to go down that road, and we've already got an architect on board and we've already got an engineer who's willing to do that math, I think
Okay,
it's worth having a
Okay.
conversation if you want to make this a resilience hub.
For here.
That makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
I mean, here we have
with a generator.
we have a
here.
generator here
Right,
that's propane based and it switches on.
yeah.
Whether you switch that out to
Or whether
batteries.
you augment again.
Right, library doesn't have anything, so I think we'd need something, but again, it's the space.
Yeah.
Where do you put those?
Yeah,
If you-
exactly.
If you wanna put them inside, are there concerns about that? And then
Yeah.
you're putting them outside, and then how do you put them outside, and then it's changing the historical,
Yeah.
and unless you're paying for
And
that.
is it,
Gotta be
is it
possible.
essential to have it?
You also lose, in the winter, you're gonna lose
A little bit,
a little bit of the
Yeah.
energy in
Well,
battery itself.
When you're
Yeah.
talking about heating the whole building with a heat pump and then trying to back up that
Right.
heat pump system with
Yeah,
batteries,
not
suddenly
gonna
the battery storage system becomes massive.
Right,
Yeah.
Right, so if we're just talking about the electric demand of the building as it is,
Yeah.
storage sounds pretty reasonable, but once you layer
Yeah.
other
Yeah,
things
good
on
point.
top, then
Well,
it
we,
gets more
we
complicated.
would not get rid of the generator here, for example, because the batteries are only gonna have a 24-hour,
right,
you know, so.
They're longer than that, aren't they?
We wouldn't get rid of the generator
Okay.
because it could go on for days.
yeah,
Those batteries are gonna max out
Oh, I
in
see what you're
24 hours.
Yeah.
If we're looking at it from.
Unless you have a solar panel system on the roof and then.
Yeah.
That's not gonna happen.
Right, it gets more
Buildings.
complicated.
no,
And the problem there is we already are offsetting our electrical energy use with the Bristol solar
Right.
project, so.
Which is great that we did it when you did it, because now it's
Yeah.
not an option anymore, so.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so it's only a very small percentage.
Yeah, it's
I thought
not,
it was
it's not the
interesting.
community solar, you
No.
guys are talking about, it's,
Oh, it's the one up on 160.
yeah, it's
In
only.
In the,
it's a
in the
small-
report, though, it only talks about this building as being offset, doesn't talk about the library or Howden Hall.
I think
Is that-
because
is there
it
a
was-
reason?
It was lower, we looked at all the
Yeah,
highest
lower
usage,
meters.
and we only get a very, very small percentage from that.
Oh, it
from
just
that array.
comes to this.
It's
It
this
comes to
and
Or
it's like,
this
it's
is
like the
six-
water pump,
6 meters,
Yeah.
yeah, water.
but it's a tiny percentage. If we put solar in any new building, it could then offset the systems more.
Okay,
Yeah,
so.
like
that's-
Howden Hall, they were talking about this.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah,
It's
well,
not-
but again, like-
That orientation is good too. Howden Hall.
Yeah.
That'd be good.
Not so much the library, but
Yeah.
But again,
well, it has a slate roof.
again,
which
it's
is
just
a problem.
historical buildings and that putting panels, yeah.
And it's only, if you don't use it, you don't get any for it.
It's really too
That
bad
much, so
the
it
town,
has to be things that you're using every month in order to
it's
get
it's
that.
too bad the town maintenance facility isn't farther along than it would.
Right.
Yeah, that
We
could be
could
really,
really gussing that.
yeah.
Oh, you all put panels on
Yeah.
there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a
Next
given
program.
if that project progresses.
Yeah.
Anything
We have
else?
lots of.
Exciting.
I mean, you just mentioned the new project, so I'm just gonna put it out there. The Public Service Department just released a new iteration of the Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Program, EECBG. And they are specifically trying to fund non-building projects, so they wanna fund planning and consultants, and because the EECBG program, the reporting requirements are massive, and so they're trying to help towns apply for money use money and not have the big, like Davis-Bacon requirements and all of those things. So they have a new program that is for planning, so if there's a project that sounds like there might be that could benefit from some like energy specific forethought,
Okay,
they might be interested in seeing an application from you.
and that would just be, but that's only energy related to a building. We'd have to have architectural designs potentially for that project. This is a new public works building, probably at a new location in Bristol.
Yeah, so I don't know all of the details of the program, I just saw the email the other day, but yeah, if we wanna have a conversation about that.
Sure.
later on, that would be
What's the program called? Energy efficiency?
Conservation Block Program. ECBG block grant, thank you.
Not the exact.
I talk in
Is it
acronyms.
BG or G?
ECBG.
Like a PVG.
After a while, you get that.
I read it like 3 times and I was wrong.
Well,
the first time.
they also are funding EV
Thanks for being here,
charger
Ian.
Sure.
projects.
Oh.
So, yeah, if other things don't work out.
Okay, did you hear that, Ian? They're also funding EV
More
charging
chargers.
projects.
Okay, good.
Charge and all that.
That'd be nice.
Have you heard anything more about that?
No, I followed up, nothing yet, so
Okay.
I'll just keep following up.
Okay,
Yeah. just
Okay,
keep
so,
track
uh,
of it.
I think our committee ought to set an evening next week when we get together.
We'll be gone next.
Okay.
Are we meeting?
Well, I'll be back on,
We are meeting on Wednesday. Yeah.
I'm gonna miss that meeting, but I'll be back on Thursday, but